In February of 1982, a doctor at the Cook County Jail examined a new prisoner and found injuries he could not explain away. Burns on the man's chest and thigh, seared in neat lines as if he'd been held against something hot. Small scabbed wounds on his ears, his nose, his fingers. Marks the doctor had no polite medical name for, because they were the marks of electrical clips. So the doctor did what doctors are supposed to do. He wrote a letter to the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, describing the injuries, demanding, his words, a thorough investigation. That letter went up the chain of command, landed on the desk of one of the most powerful men in Illinois, and died there. No answer. No investigation. Nothing. It would take Chicago 33 years to say out loud what that one page said in 1982, and when the city finally did, it would say it in a school book. The man the letter was about, the man whose detectives put those marks on that prisoner, was named John Burge. He was a decorated Vietnam veteran, a rising star of the Chicago Police Department, and for almost 20 years was detective, sergeant, and finally commander on the city's South Side. He and the men around him tortured confessions out of more than 100 human beings. Electric shock, suffocation, mock executions, more than 100 victims, and almost every one of them a black man. Now hold on to the fact this entire film hangs on. John Burge was never charged with torture. Not in 1982, not in 1993, not ever. And yet he died a convicted felon who served time in a federal prison. Both of those things are true at once, and the space between them, how the law finally reached a man it had already forgiven, is the strangest and maybe the most honest story American justice has ever told about itself. Remember the letter. It's coming back. To understand how a torture chamber operated inside an American police station for 2 decades, you have to understand that nobody built it in secret. It was built in plain sight by a man the city kept promoting. John Burge grew up in South Deering, a steel mill neighborhood on Chicago's southeast side, a white enclave in a part of the city that was changing around it. At 18, he joined the Army. He volunteered for Vietnam, served as a military policeman with the 9th Infantry Division, and came home in 1969 with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a chest full of commendations. A war hero by every measure his country used. In March of 1970, he joined the Chicago Police Department, and his rise was close to vertical. Detective within 2 years, sergeant by 1977, lieutenant by 1981, and that same year, still in his early 30s, he was given command of the brand new Violent Crimes Unit at Area 2, the detective division covering a huge stretch of the South Side. His numbers were spectacular. Cases closed. Confessions signed. Convictions won. The department gave him commendations. The newspapers gave him headlines. Nobody in charge asked the one question that mattered. Why did so many suspects in this one building, under this one commander, sign so many confessions? Here is why. On the midnight shift at Area 2, a group of detectives worked under Burge. White men, working a black part of the city, who would later become known by a nickname that sounds like Pulp Fiction and is instead sworn court record, the Midnight Crew. And the Midnight Crew had tools. There was a box, a plain, dark, hand-cranked device, the size of a lunch pail, with 2 wires coming out of it. Men who survived that room describe it the same way, across decades without ever having met each other. The crank turns, and electricity goes into your ears, your fingers, your genitals, until you say what the men in the room want you to say. Detectives kept plastic typewriter covers in the office, ordinary gray office plastic, and they had a use for them that had nothing to do with typewriters, over a man's head, held tight until the world went dark. They called it bagging. There were guns pressed to heads in games the suspect didn't know were games. And there was the radiator, cast iron hissing hot, for handcuffed men to be held against until the burns rose in neat parallel lines. I am telling you this in a list clinically once because you need to know exactly what the word torture means in this story. The film will not show it to you. The record is enough. Where did the box come from? Men who served in Burge's own military police company in Vietnam later told reporters they had seen prisoners interrogated there with hand-cranked field telephones. Wires, crank, current. Burge denied ever seeing or doing any such thing in Vietnam or in Chicago. What nobody disputes is that within a few years of his coming home, a hand-cranked electrical device was being turned on handcuffed men in a police station on the south side of Chicago. It started early. In May of 1973, detectives brought in a man named Anthony Holmes. Decades later, under oath in a federal courtroom, Holmes would describe what Burge did to him. He plugged it into the wall and came towards me. He said, "You're going to tell us what we want to know." And then, I didn't know if it was daytime or nighttime. He just kept shocking me. Holmes blacked out again and again. When he could speak, he confessed. The confession became a conviction. The conviction became 30 years, and the 30 years became a commendation in somebody's personnel file. And that is the machine whole and running in one paragraph. A suspect, almost always a black man, often with a record, the kind of man 1970s Chicago had decided in advance not to believe, goes into a room. Pain comes out of a box. A confession comes out of the pain. A conviction comes out of the confession. And the commander's career comes out of the convictions. Every man who stumbled out of Area 2 and told a public defender what had happened to him ran into the same wall. It was his word, a word already labeled criminal, against the word of a decorated war hero with a badge. The tally climbed through the 70s and into the 80s. 1 man. 5. 20. The number will keep climbing for this entire film, and I want you to watch it climb because the click of that counter is the sound of a city deciding, over and over, year after year, not to listen. Then in February of 1982, the machine made its one great mistake. It left marks on a man the whole world was watching. On February 9, 1982, 2 Chicago police officers, William Fahey and Richard O'Brien, were shot and killed during a traffic stop. The murder of 2 officers set off one of the largest manhunts in the city's history. Days of raids across the South Side, doors kicked in, a neighborhood turned inside out. On February 14th, they caught the man who did it, Andrew Wilson. Let me be straight with you about Andrew Wilson, because this story only works if I am. He was guilty. He murdered those 2 officers, a jury said so twice, and this film mourns Fahey and O'Brien without reservation. Andrew Wilson is not in this story because he was innocent. He is in this story because of what 14 hours inside Area 2 did to him. And because the American rule against torturing prisoners is not a prize for the innocent. It is a line, and it either holds for the worst man in the room or it holds for no one. Wilson came into Area 2 in the custody of John Burge's detectives on the morning of the 14th. When he was delivered to the county jail, the intake staff counted roughly 15 separate injuries. Cuts and bruises from beatings, yes, but also the other marks. Scabbed clip wounds on his ears and nose. And on his chest and thigh, second-degree burns laid out in straight parallel lines. Lines that matched exactly the ribs of the steam radiator in the interview room. He had been shocked with the box, burned against the iron, and a gun had been put in his mouth until he confessed. 3 days later comes the letter you already know. Dr. John Raba, medical director at the jail, examined Wilson, wrote down what he found, and sent it to Police Superintendent Richard Burge demanding a thorough investigation of this alleged brutality. Burge did not simply shred it. What he did was, in its way, worse because it was procedure. He forwarded the letter to the Cook County State's Attorney, the chief prosecutor of the county, and asked how he should proceed, since prosecuting Wilson and investigating his torturers might collide. The state's attorney's office never answered him. Not a letter, not a phone call, nothing, while that same office took Wilson's tortured confession and used it to win a death sentence. The prosecutor who received that letter and let it die was named Richard M. Daley. Hold that name however you like. He would go on to be mayor of Chicago for 22 years. A quarter of a century later, official investigators would put it in writing. The letter reached his desk, and no investigation of any kind followed. The letter was buried. But paper has a strange property in this story. It keeps coming back. It came back in 1987 when the Illinois Supreme Court threw out Wilson's conviction because the confession had been beaten out of him. The court could count radiator ribs too. He was retried without the confession, convicted again on other evidence, and sent away for life, which tells you the torture was never even necessary. And it came back in 1989 when Wilson, a cop killer with nothing left to lose, represented by a small band of civil rights lawyers at the People's Law Office, sued John Burge in federal court, and for the first time, the box itself was carried into a courtroom for jurors to see. The city's lawyers fought the case with everything, and the first jury hung. But during that trial, something extraordinary happened. Anonymous letters began arriving at the lawyer's office. 4 of them, over 5 months, written by someone inside Area 2, a police source the lawyers codenamed Deep Badge. The letters said, in effect, "You have no idea how big this is." They pointed to other victims. They pointed to a man named Melvin Jones, who had been shocked with the box by Burge himself just 9 days before Andrew Wilson. Same device, same hands, different man with no connection to any dead officer. The pattern was there, in the department's own knowledge, mailed out of the building by one of its own. And still the second jury returned a verdict so tangled, it found the city had a de facto policy of abusing cop-killing suspects while somehow clearing the men who did it. It took a federal appeals court in 1993 to sweep that nonsense aside. Meanwhile, a reporter had been sitting in that courtroom. His name was John Conroy, and in January of 1990, he published a story in the Chicago Reader. A long, meticulous, devastating account called House of Screams. It laid the whole thing out. The box, the burns, the letter, the pattern. And here is the part of this story that should frighten you more than the box does. Almost nothing happened. No wave of prosecutions, no citywide reckoning. Conroy would write 23 articles about Area 2 over 17 years. A man standing in the town square pointing at a fire, in print with footnotes. And for most of those years, the city simply declined to turn its head. The screams had been heard. Hearing them changed nothing. That is what impunity actually looks like. Not a secret, but a fact everyone has agreed to live with. The paper kept coming. In 1990, the police department's own internal investigator, Michael Goldston, finished a report on Area 2. His conclusion, in the department's own official language, the abuse was systematic. It spanned more than a decade. It included psychological techniques and planned torture. Planned torture, 2 words typed by the police department about the police department. The city's response was to lock the report in a drawer and fight for 2 years to keep it there, until a federal judge ordered it released in 1992. After that, something finally had to be done, and watch carefully what the something was. In February of 1993, after a disciplinary trial before the police board, John Burge was fired. Fired for the physical abuse of Andrew Wilson, the board's own words. The 2 detectives charged alongside him were suspended and went back to work. And Burge packed up, left Chicago, and drove south to a house in Apollo Beach, Florida, near Tampa, where the water is warm. In time, he had a police pension of roughly $3,000 a month in a 40-foot cabin cruiser. He named the boat Vigilante. Under oath years later, he would claim he picked the name at random. Count what the city knew by 1993. A doctor's letter, a Supreme Court reversal, a federal civil verdict, an inside informant, 23 articles worth of journalism, its own report with the words planned torture, more than 50 named victims and counting. And the sum total of consequence for John Burge, commander of it all, was this. He lost his job. No handcuffs, no charges, no trial. A man was fired for torture the way you might be fired for padding an expense report, and that, everyone assumed, was the end of it. It should have been, because standing between John Burge and any courtroom was something stronger than money, stronger than the code of silence, stronger than City Hall, something built into the law itself, and it had already run out. Every crime in Illinois, almost every crime anywhere, comes with a clock. It's called the Statute of Limitations, and the idea behind it is old and mostly decent. Evidence rots, memories fade, and a just society shouldn't hang ancient accusations over a man forever. For the crimes that fit what happened at Area 2, aggravated battery, official misconduct, Illinois law gave prosecutors 3 years. 3 years from the moment the crank turned to the last day charges could be filed. Now run the arithmetic of this story against that clock. Anthony Holmes, 1973. The clock died in 1976. Andrew Wilson, February 1982. The clock died in February 1985, while the letter about him sat unanswered in a prosecutor's filing system. Every victim of the 80s expired by the early 90s, before the Goldstein report ever saw daylight. Do you see the shape of it? The perfect crime is not the one nobody discovers. It's the one nobody with power believes until belief has an expiration date. And the men who ran Chicago managed not to believe this one for exactly long enough. The clock was never going to catch John Burge. The clock was his alibi, and the city's silence had wound it. But the victims would not stay quiet, and by the early 2000s, the pressure had grown too great to ignore. In 2002, a judge appointed 2 special prosecutors, Edward Egan and Robert Boyle, with one assignment: investigate Area 2, all of it, and determine once and for all whether crimes had been committed. They worked for 4 years. They spent about $7 million. They examined 148 claims of torture. And in July of 2006, they delivered a report that said, in substance, everything the victims had been saying for 30 years. The abuse was real. They believed torture had occurred in roughly half the cases they examined. In 3 of them, Andrew Wilson's among them, they found proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Enough evidence right now to convict John Burge and his men in any courtroom in America. Sit with that sentence. And then came the conclusion, the one the lawyers had known was coming and the survivors could hardly bear to hear. Charges filed, none. Every provable crime was decades past its 3-year clock. The special prosecutors had built a perfect case for a trial that could never legally begin. The state of Illinois had finally officially expensively believed the victims, and its belief was worth nothing. Except, and here the story turns, the confessions themselves were still doing damage, live in the present tense. Because while the torturers could not be prosecuted, the tortured were still in prison. Some of them were waiting to be executed. They called themselves the Death Row 10, condemned men in Illinois whose death sentences rested on confessions that had come out of Area 2. Through the late 90s, they organized from inside their cells. Leaflets typed on death row, mothers marching outside, lawyers digging through transcripts. Their cases landed on the desk of Governor George Ryan, a Republican pharmacist from small-town Illinois, who had supported the death penalty his entire career, and who now found himself reading, case after case, about the box and the bag and the radiator. In 2000, he froze every execution in the state, and in January 2003, in his final days in office, he did 2 things no American governor had done in living memory. On January 10th, he pardoned 4 of the Death Row 10 outright: Aaron Patterson, Madison Hobley, Leroy Orange, Stanley Howard. Pardoned on the grounds of innocence, men tortured into confessing crimes the state now said they did not commit. 4 men walked off death row not through some technicality, but because the governor of Illinois declared the confessions that condemned them to be the fruit of torture. The next day, he emptied death row entirely, 167 commutations, telling a law school audience, "Our capital system is haunted by the demon of error in determining guilt, and error in determining who among the guilty deserves to die." Hold the split screen for a moment, because the whole scandal lives inside it. In Chicago, tortured men are walking out of prison, blinking in the cold, pardoned, apologized to, their confessions declared poison. And 1,100 miles south, in the Florida sunshine, the man whose detectives extracted those confessions is stepping onto a boat called Vigilante, his pension arriving on schedule, legally untouchable. A man officially confirmed as the author of systematic, planned torture, and officially beyond the reach of any criminal court on earth for it. That should be the end of the story. It is not because of 4 sheets of paper and a man who could not stop lying. In November 2003, with Ryan's pardon still fresh in the city's memory, lawyers for Madison Hobley, one of the 4 pardoned men, now suing Burge in federal court, sent Burge a routine set of written questions called interrogatories. Standard civil procedure. Lawyers exchange them by the thousand. Did you ever use torture or abuse on suspects at Area 2? Were you ever aware of it? Burge could have refused to answer, pleaded the fifth, as other Area 2 men did. Instead, from Florida, he wrote back, no. Never used it. Never saw it. Never knew of it. And he signed his name under oath. He thought he was swatting a fly. He had just handed the government the only weapon it would ever get. Here is the move, and it is almost elegant. The torture of 1973, of 1982, of 1991, legally dead, every count of it, sealed behind the statute of limitations. But a lie signed in November 2003 is not a crime of 1982. It is a brand new federal felony, perjury, obstruction of justice, committed the moment the pen left the paper, with a clock that starts fresh. The federal government could never punish John Burge for what he did. But when he denied under oath that he had done it, the denial itself was a crime it could punish. The United States Attorney in Chicago at the time was Patrick Fitzgerald, and his office saw the opening. As he put it, with a prosecutor's bluntness, the statutes of limitations on the old crimes were gone. The lie was not. On the morning of October 21, 2008, FBI agents walked up the drive of a tidy house in Apollo Beach, Florida, and arrested John Burge. 26 years after Dr. Raba's letter, 15 years after the firing that was supposed to be the end of it. The charge sheet read, 2 counts of obstruction of justice, 1 count of perjury. Announcing the indictment, Fitzgerald said something worth engraving. There is no place for torture and abuse in a police station. There is no place for perjury and false statements in federal lawsuits. The trial in the spring of 2010 was the trial Chicago had dodged for a generation, because to prove the lie, the government had to prove the torture. For 5 weeks, a federal courtroom heard everything the statute of limitations had buried. Anthony Holmes, 37 years after his night with the box, finally testifying to a jury. He plugged it into the wall and came towards me. Melvin Jones, the medical records, the letter. The defense answered the only way it could. These men are convicts, liars, cop haters. The same argument that had worked for 30 years. It did not work this time. On June 28, 2010, the jury found John Burge guilty on every count. In the corridor outside, Melvin Jones, tortured 9 days before Andrew Wilson, said, "I got justice, something I have been wanting for 28 years." At sentencing in January 2011, Burge told the court, "I am 63 years old, and while I try to keep a proud face, in reality I am a broken man." Anthony Holmes rose and answered him without raising his voice. "I don't hate him. I hate what he did to me, and I hate the fact that nobody would listen to me when I tried to tell people about it." It fell on deaf ears. Judge Joan Lefkoe asked the question that hangs over this whole story. How can one trust the system of justice when the system is so defiled? And sentenced John Burge to 4.5 years in federal prison. 4.5 years. I am not going to dress that number up for you. More than 100 men tortured, men who served 10, 20, 30 years on confessions cranked out of a box. 2 decades of a city's willful deafness. And the bill, when it finally came, was 54 months for lying about it, served mostly in a low-security federal facility in North Carolina. If that number feels like an insult, trust the feeling. It is a fraction of what the underlying conduct deserved, the going rate of a system that had let the real charges die. And yet, hold both truths, it was more than any of his victims had ever been promised. In the entire history of the scandal, it is the only criminal sentence anyone ever served for what happened at Area 2. The man who beat the clock was beaten in the end by his own signature. Chicago, meanwhile, was not finished insulting the survivors. Days after the sentencing, the police pension board met to decide whether a man imprisoned for lying about torture should keep collecting his police pension. 4 civilian members voted to strip it. 4 police members voted to let him keep it. 4-4, a tie, and under the rules, a tie meant Burge won. The state's attorney general fought it all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court and lost. Every month from his cell and then from his Florida living room, the pension arrived. The city paying the man its own report had named, roughly $3,000 at a time, until the day he died. He walked out of custody in February 2015, unbroken in the only way that mattered to him. Within weeks, when word came that Chicago was considering paying reparations to his victims, Burge released a statement through a police blog. He wrote that he found it hard to believe the city's leadership could even contemplate giving reparations to human vermin. Human vermin. Keep those two words in your ear. They are the last public words that matter from John Burge, and the city was about to answer them. On May 6, 2015, the Chicago City Council did something no city in the history of the United States had ever done. It passed reparations, formal, legislated reparations, for police violence. Not a court settlement forced by lawyers. A law passed unanimously in the name of the city itself. A $5.5 million fund for 57 living survivors of Area 2 and Area 3. A formal apology delivered on the council floor, the mayor calling the torture a stain on the reputation of this great city as survivors watched from the gallery. Men who had waited 30 years to hear an official mouth say the word sorry. Free tuition at the city's colleges, not just for survivors, but for their children and their grandchildren, because torture runs down generations, and the city finally admitted it. A counseling center on the South Side, the Chicago Torture Justice Center, built specifically to treat the survivors of its own police force. And one more thing, the one John Burge could never buy back with a pension or outrun on a boat. The ordinance ordered the story into the schools. Since 2018, every Chicago public school student, 8th grade, and again in 10th, is taught a required history unit about what happened at Area 2. It has a name, Reparations 1, the tally of victims, the box, the buried letter, the men who fought, printed, bound, mandatory. Anthony Holmes, who once said his words fell on deaf ears, has told his story to the teachers who teach it. The children of Chicago are the ears now. John Burge died on September 19, 2018 in Florida at 70, pension intact, denials intact, unrepentant to the last breath. And the truth simply kept going without him. Courts have gone on overturning Area 2 convictions after his death, year after year. Jackie Wilson, Andrew's brother, declared innocent in 2020, and more men in 2024 and 2025, with hundreds of claims still moving through a state torture commission that exists uniquely in America because of this one man. The public bill passed $210 million years ago and is still climbing. And in the summer of 2026 on Martin Luther King Drive, the city finally broke ground on a permanent memorial to the survivors. 11 years late, like everything in this story, but coming. So go back to the letter. February 1982, one page, one doctor doing his job, 3 words, a thorough investigation. It was the truth, complete and sufficient, 33 years early. Everything the city ever needed to know was on that page, and the page was buried, and the burying costing 100 men their bodies and their years, and taxpayers a fortune, and 2 more decades of poisoned verdicts. Now look at where the page ended up. The man who buried the truth beat every charge the law could name, except the one he committed by denying it. He kept his pension. He kept his boat. He kept his contempt all the way to human vermin. And he still lost more completely than a prison sentence could ever have managed, because the thing he spent 40 years calling a lie is now taught, by law, to every child in Chicago. His victims' names are in the textbook. His is too, as the man who did it. He beat the statute of limitations. Nobody beats the curriculum. The letter was buried in a file in 1982. It came back as a chapter. That is the whole moral of this story, and it is worth carrying with you. The truth can be ignored, outweighted, even legally forgiven, and still refuse to die as long as somebody keeps writing it down. If you think the letter should have been enough the first time, hit like so the next one gets read.